Welcome to Literary Deep Dives and Discussions with me, A.L. Liskey, the author of the Unseen Operative series. Today is just me, and this is going to be very interesting. Try to do this with camera. If it ends up being audio, then it'll just be audio, because it's a little bit of a tricky topic today. As some of you may have listened, I have been on a podcast recently called What the Haze with Hayes Wolfton. And since that podcast, it's been on my mind that there was a question that he posed to me about how trauma presents in my work. And I was very vague about it on that podcast. I didn't have a prepared ready answer, but also because it really is a deep topic. So I feel that it is very, very important to kind of address it in a podcast. I guess I better begin with, I want to begin with a brief preface, and that's that this episode is about trauma in literature. It's not so much about what trauma is, what causes trauma, how we're supposed to respond to trauma. If that's the sort of video that you're looking for, this is not that place. On this podcast, we strictly try to stick to discussing things found in literature, how it applies to us in real life, and kind of the background messages therein. So that is kind of what I'm focusing on. Also not here to talk about trauma that's caused by literature, although that is a prevalent topic, especially to me, given my collegiate studies on family relationships, human development, and so forth. It is a very important topic, but that could be its own episode, and that is not it today. Today is just strictly looking at the Lattice Scheme, how I present trauma and why I present trauma the way that I do in my literature. So this is my take. Hopefully in the future we'll be having other authors giving their takes on trauma in literature. So, but I do also want to put a strong emphasis for everybody who is considering reading my book, that even though there are points to be made about trauma, justice, accountability, marks, ideas, etc., all of those things, this book is not a heavy, dark, like collegiate level, deep book, kind of like Harry Potter or the Chronicles of Narnia. Like, there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of lighthearted moments, adventure, funny things, potential for romance, all of that sort of thing. Trauma is probably like 5 to 6%. It is still very important that it is in there, because it is a mystery. Crime fiction kind of evolves around all sorts of things, and trauma is often included therein. So it's an important part, but it is not the bulk of the book. So please don't let this topic dissuade you from buying the book, from reading the book, and hopefully when we're able to afford the audiobook, listening to it. That would be my preferred method, but we'll see what the future brings. With the kind of book that it is, many folks will read straight through it without ever getting any of the points that I talk about deeply on this podcast out of it. And that's okay. Really, when it comes to literature in general, what you want to get out of that book is heavily up to you. If you're an analytical, pragmatic, or deep thinker like I am, you're probably going to pull a lot more out of the page than even the author probably intended. But authors like me, we write specifically so that you can have a deeper reflection upon what you read. But at the same time, if you don't want that, it's still a great story just to kind of go through. So, you decide what you want out of it. And then finally, I do want to be clear again that this episode is not about how to write trauma. I'm not going to teach you how to write it as an author. There are several authors that do it so much better than I do, who are just more versed in describing trauma, especially in the various elements that are therein. I do it differently. I didn't intend to write about trauma. A little bit, again, that I had mentioned about the Lattice Scheme is that the book largely wrote itself. I had a vague idea of what it was going to be. I did have a couple plot points that I thought would happen. Wrote the first four chapters myself, and it went nowhere. And then I just I let my heart, my head, my hands, and God take over, and it developed. So, the way that trauma manifests in my book was not necessarily me putting it in. Again, though, all of the dreams sequences do come from actual dreams of mine. That isn't me trying to put myself into the book. All of it was edited and used in a different way, in which trauma was often presented. So it is an intriguing thing. And that is about how much I will say about that. Yeah. Again, if you are looking for serious trauma books, horror books, thrillers, they have a lot of that. I could definitely recommend you a few. I don't write horror. I don't write thrillers, so it doesn't get that dark and heavy in my book. It's more realistic. So there are like mental illnesses, mental disorders, emotional things, all of that will be presented, but in a more realistic way. Also, just kind of wanted to make a note on that in literature in general, there is a lot of misrepresentations, particularly about trauma, about mental disorders, about physical disorders, all that sort of thing. So if you're thinking like, I don't want to read a book that has anything to do with trauma, most of the books that you read probably have a little bit of something in there about it. So, you know, even though it's subtly disguised, don't think for a minute that you've never read a book that has something in it of the sort. It just depends on how deeply you look into it. Anyways, enough about that. Let's get on to the real topic, how trauma presents in the Lattice Scheme. So we're going to kind of look at 3 specific characters in my book that have different sorts of trauma. That will be Alma Morales, Mario Ramazi, or Alessio Scigliano, whichever you want to identify him as, and Isabelle. We'll just kind of start with looking at Alma from an outside perspective. You know, when it comes to trauma, physical reactions tend to differ among people, especially depending on what the types of trauma are. Trauma is not the same as mental illness. Yeah, trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or series of experiences that overwhelm a person's ability to cope, leaving a lasting negative effect on the mental, emotional, or physiological well-being. It disrupts a sense of safety and self, and common manifestations of it include intense fear, helplessness, or disassociation. So it is subjective. Trauma is subjective to every individual that experiences it, how they experience it, what traumatizes me may not traumatize you, so forth. There's also acute versus chronic trauma. So acute trauma is trauma that occurs from a single episode, something poignant, sharp, subtle, temporary. Like it is a kind of one and done thing, but it still can affect you for a long time. So acute trauma isn't necessarily describing how long you experience symptoms or, you know, take away from that. It's the episode itself was short. Chronic trauma is ongoing. It's prolonged is a good way to put it. And, you know, with the longer trauma is prolonged, the more prolific the effect. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. And then there's complex trauma, which is when you have multiple episodes of trauma. Maybe you have acute and chronic. Maybe you have several acute ones throughout the years. Maybe you have an acute one back when you're like 5, and then 20 years later you have a chronic one or another acute one, etc. So complex is just kind of a mesh of multiple traumatic experiences. So yeah, and then of course there's various severities of it, various responses, coping, symptoms, etc., all of those sorts of types. So yeah, going back to Alma Morales, trauma first appears in the Lattice Scheme when Azure goes to question her to try Detective Granger's little theory if she remembers anything about the Wyoming mission, Mahomes. You know, he needs to find who the person to this name is. That is part of his job. Spoiler alert there. But for some reason he wants to know. So Azure, she decides, you know, I'll bite. I'll see how legit this is. She approaches Alma after work, and Alma gives a curious response. I want to get the right wording here that I wrote in my book. By the way, this is my podcast book. It's, as you can see, it has a lot of notes in it. Yeah, but so she asks Alma, have you ever heard of an agent called Mahomes? Very bluntly, she just throws it out there. Alma pauses, her shoulders stiffen before she turns back. Her eyes narrow slightly. There's a flicker of something in them, like concern or recognition, maybe even fear. And then it just vanishes. And she gives this response, Mahomes, you say, that is an interesting name to bring up. And she says it very steady and controlled. I'm afraid I have no acquaintance by that name. However, my particular cases have always involved at most 4 individuals, so my interactions with others in the Bureau are quite limited. Why do you ask? The last response that Alma gives after Azure kind of tries at it again is that curiosity can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's best to let certain anomalies remain unexplored or handled by the compliance division. Then she says goodnight and walks away. Interesting response there. So how is that traumatic? As a person who has experienced trauma in her life, I can tell you that a lot of us who have trauma, when something triggers or touches upon that trauma in any small way that we, like, if there's an association in us with whatever you ask or say or do to that trauma, we kind of stiffen up. Because when others know our trauma, like, yes, there is kind of a measure of relief, like, oh, it's out in the open. At the same time, it's like, we're horrified, we're suspicious, we're, mixed feelings. There's mixed realities between trust and untrust, what's real, what's not real, all that sort of thing. So, like, we're trying to figure out how actually interested and sincere this individual in front of us is. If they're going to ask more about it, try to dig more in what exactly their motive in asking is. Like, we want all of these things to be figured out before we respond. But at the same time, having trauma, especially chronic trauma, I want to be very clear that Alma's trauma is, well, it's not even chronic. It's chronic and acute. It is complex trauma. She has a lot of trauma that we are going to unpack more in book 2 and book 3. But because she's got all of that behind her, and this person who she's known for a couple months is kind of probing into that, how is she going to respond? She has a programmed response. You become so used to living with trauma when it's complex that you kind of just live in this filter. You have these filtered responses to keep yourself protected. Some people in fight or flight mode, they shut down completely. And some trauma responses are like that. They shut down completely. Other trauma responses, like, they panic and you can see it on their faces. And then there's a lot of us who have those complex chronic traumas. We have this filter of calmness, of confidence, of, just easily sliding out of the conversation or just making it natural so that nobody questions things. I personally do this a lot. If somebody asks me, how's your dad? My automatic response is, I haven't seen him in a while, I don't know. Or it's, he's doing good. End of conversation. Like, it's done. Because I'm not going to talk to them more about this. I don't know if what I say to them is going to get back to him. And I don't know if, they actually care. And even if they do, it's like, why would I tell you? These things are really deep and powerful and personal kind of things. So she's got a filter on, is what I'm calling it. And that is her response. And you can see for the most of the book that Alma is she's very upbeat. She's very composed. She's kind of a kick butt agent too. You'll see that more in the second book, but she knows what she's doing. Even though she's had all this trauma, she is a regular functioning agent of the Bureau. And so that might confuse some people, because it's like, if you've experienced trauma, how can you be normal? And, a lot of folks that experience severe traumas do appear normal. Some of us, especially those who have had chronic childhood traumas, we've grown up learning how to present ourselves as normal. It doesn't mean that we're faking it. This is a different kind of reality, is what I'm trying to describe here. Kind of like, we wear different hats. We act a certain way when we're with our private friends and at home with family, in a very, not a super different way, but a kind of different way, a more professional way when we're at work. It's very much like that with cases like mine and Alma's. Alma was not based on me, by the way. She is based on 3 people that I know, though, who have traumas. But yeah, you are still you in all situations, but the way that you present yourself is different. You can be very, very composed in public and very private and very focused. And at home, you're still you, but you might have a couple more breakdowns, or you might have more of a mouth, or you might, be more moody. It's still you. It is a different presentation. So that is just one aspect to consider, that some trauma cases do handle things well. Kind of like mental illness, which, man, I don't remember if I touched on this, but yeah, mental illness and trauma, they are not the same thing. They're not. Trauma it is correlated to the onset of mental illness, sometimes in later years, and sometimes not. I will touch on that later. Don't worry. I will get back to that. I know I will. We're just going to carry on to that point, though. So that's the first outward presentation that we see. With the other 2 characters, Mario, Ramazi, and Isabelle, it's a little more complex. Mario, because he is suffering from an identity amnesia of sorts, which is triggered by a trauma, which we discover later in the book. Sorry, spoilers, but yeah. He presents very, very, very normal. Like he's a regular functioning person on the outside. He knows what he's doing. He's cheerful. He's happy. He's engaged. Life is good. Isabelle is kind of the same. Yeah, we think she's playing a game about, faking knowing English. And, after that gets resolved, she seems very cooperative with a lot of things in person. And then the next minute, suddenly she'll be like all clammed up and won't talk. It almost feels bipolar. And sometimes traumas are like that, is they can present like a mental illness without being a mental illness, if that makes any sense. It does to me, because I've lived with it and I've dealt with it and I've experienced it. But for a regular functioning person, it might sound crazy to watch a person act one way or the other and them not actually have a mental illness. And that really comes to a difference of understanding how things are diagnosed and how things actually are. Traumas being those distressing events that can affect the full body is very different than a neural imbalance. Mental illness, it's not the same as a trauma. There's genetics in there. It can be caused by trauma. There's associations like conditioning that may occur that causes you to respond a certain way or perceive things a different way. But mental is really, it's in your head, how you think, how you perceive things, how you function, how you identify things, how you interpret things. That's kind of where mental illness comes in, what you see, think, and how you process. Trauma can be full body. Mental is mainly here, but it does also affect the body. They are very different. Definitely encourage you to look them up. I'm not a professional psychiatrist or psychologist. My studies are all on human development and relationship science, so that is my spectrum. I don't want to overstep my scope of ability and practice. So Ramazi, he is the first one that we kind of get a deeper look into the subconscious manifestations of trauma. Something beautiful about my book that I had never intended to happen, but it did, and this is God working through me, is what I say, is that in order to explore the human condition, it's really hard to do that when you're focused on one POV of one character. As you're being our main character, how am I supposed to present other people's heads? Well, the subconscious does that for us. We're able to take a peek into Alma's subconscious, Mario's subconscious, Isabelle's, Laurent's, Haji's, so many different individuals, and kind of get a glimpse into who they are and what they're thinking. Granted that dreams can be pretty fantastical, but there's still little elements of truth, information that is being dragged in there to create things. So we do get to see a little bit of trauma in those dreams. And that's where we really get to see particularly Mario Ramazi's trauma. Let me see if I can pick up the correct pages here. So the first time that Mario Ramazi is looked at, Azure goes into his mind. Yeah, and the very first dream kind of starts in this forest. Like there is a broken down plane. He's with a group of people. They kind of travel up this like flooded area. The environment, like it dissolves. They get into this hotel and there's this lady with him, and she's all panicking because I didn't turn off my device. People are going to track us. So obviously they're hiding from something. There's an explosion, trying to get away from things. Then NREM sleep kicks in, which is when the mind is less active. So Azure's trying to figure out what's going on. Doesn't make sense. Some dreams don't make sense. So that doesn't necessarily seem traumatic, but the notion that there is something happening and that there was a person actually does hint that there was a relationship trauma, which we will see later on in the book. So that's just a very subtle hint there at the beginning. His next dream comes in, and he introduces the lady next to him as Ariane, but every time he mentions her name, there's another voice that's saying, you don't say that. You cannot say this name. It's not okay. There's fighting internally within himself about a name and about a work. And so this is when we start to see the trauma shift within him between his two identities, that something is not adding up, that there's an incongruity within himself. So it changes again. Now he's at his house, Gigliano Manor, and he's trying to figure out, where can we put all these guests? And eventually he goes out to a pool, the pool which is shaped like a moon, a very skinny moon, and an urge comes from within him, not from the other voice that he'd been arguing with, but just from within himself, to jump in before it's found. And Azure, of course, she's posing as Isabelle now, and she says, find what? And he snaps out of it and goes back into his regular character. That's the first instance that we really see him reassociating with his true identity, that something needs to be hidden. And just like that, he snaps back into his new traumatized, induced identity. So there's a kind of mixed reality going on there. And, just to say a little bit about that is, with very serious traumas that impact you emotionally and mentally, because, I've never heard of a trauma that impacts you emotionally without playing with your mind. In fact, I've never personally met anybody who's had a serious trauma or an acute trauma that didn't have some altered sense of reality or questioning of it for some period of time, sometimes recurrent. I can kind of relate to Mario Ramazi in that sense that, what is real and what is not real? Who am I? We get this sense of who am I when you experience trauma, not even because necessarily you have a problem with yourself or you don't know who you are. It's just that for some reason, what you perceived was true about reality has now shifted, and therefore who you are has too. It's just the way that it works. You can't question one scope of what you've always perceived to be real without questioning every single part of you, even if you're very solidly put together. I've recently had a rehash of a trauma, which re-triggered several traumas, and I've kind of gone through that again. Is, who am I? Who's Aliski? What is she doing with her life? Do I actually have these talents? Do I actually have these skills? Inherently, I know who I am. I know what talents I have. I know what I'm doing. I know my planning for the future, my goals, all these things. I know these things. But because the trauma messes with the emotions, your brain kind of does this flip on reality. So even though you know that, you no longer know that. And it's a back and forth battle. And it's not like it lasts 24/7 all day. Sometimes it could be just a couple seconds and then you're perfectly normal, or you disassociate till you get normal. I don't experience this a lot, so please don't think that. But even if you do, it really doesn't matter. This is just how it is, and trying to be realistic here. But there is that fight of reality that a regular functioning normal person doesn't really experience. The best way I can describe it to somebody who is healthy and never had a serious trauma is, it's kind of like when you're a kid and you believe Santa Claus is real, and then you find out he's not. And you're like, oh, how'd the presents appear under the tree? And then, then you have a mystery on your hands. So you figure that out, or your parents are like, oh, by the way, it was us. And mystery solved. But you have to reconcile your mind that all those times that you thought were so magical was actually your parents. That's the best way that I can relate it to you. So it's like that, but on a way more personal level. If you did experience trauma from finding out Santa Claus wasn't real, I feel for you. Trauma can happen from that. That can be an acute trauma. So I'm not trying to downplay that in any way. That's just the easiest way to convey this. But going on with Mario and his subconscious. Okay, so next time Azure goes into his dreams, yes, he's in the museum kind of where he works, and she follows him down into this stairwell basement after seeing Wagner, interacting with Wagner. She finds him kind of sitting there, and he's trying to figure out, how do I get rid of Dr. and Mrs. Olson, or how do I hide them? Because, this whole exchange thing it's just not going to work with them. And, I feel like I'm in trouble. He's really struggling with these emotions. And so Azure kind of sits down next to him and tries to figure out what's going on. He kind of starts to not panic, but feel these sensations of pain, physical pain. as he's trying to think about things to do and sticking to the plan, again, there's that voice, and he feels physical pain, and it's all over. And because Azure is sharing his subconscious, she can feel it too. This very sharp pain all over the body, and he's just wreathing and trying to get away from it. That is more related to physical induced trauma. You know, those who grow up, or even if you've been in a relationship of domestic violence, if you have been beat up by somebody, if you have been punched by somebody, if you have been attacked by somebody, if you have seen somebody being attacked, there's also vicarious trauma, by the way, where you watched it happen to someone else and it feels like you were the one getting attacked or hurt. Physical violent trauma, that is what he is experiencing, which we learn later on in the book. And he's feeling that pain all over his body, and so is Azure. Sometimes it is very closely related to PSTD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is from trauma. It is a trauma-induced disorder. So that's kind of where the mental health and trauma really, really, really meet hand in hand immediately and stay firmly together, is post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you get something that triggers that, whatever sensation it was that you experienced during that trauma can come back to you exactly as if it was happening in real life again. In fact, there are studies that the brain literally interprets whatever trigger happened as the event itself occurring. So you'll get the exact same pain signals in your mind. Your muscles will react the same, your heart will react the same, you know, all the body processes will react the same, your emotions will react the same as if it's happening again. And that can be utterly paralyzing. It's very, very different from a panic attack. Some people do have panic attacks in PSTD. I'd say a good majority do, but it manifests very differently from everyone else. Interesting thing about my father is he did have acute PSTD at one point, and I remember, it's a very long story, but there was one time I wanted to check if he was okay, and I was behind him, and I just touched his shoulder, and when he turned around and looked at me, the horror in his eyes and the panic and the color that drained from his face, it was shocking to me. I had never seen my dad scared, but seeing him scared then, like that was beyond new territory for me. And that was just a very minor, it's not really it's still serious, but it was a lesser reaction of PSTD. So that's kind of where it's presenting for Mario Ramazi, very subtly. Azure doesn't look into this very, very, very deeply because she's not a psychologist. Neither am I. She's observing and trying to piece things together. And later on, this makes sense. But at the time, it really doesn't. And, sometimes in normal people's dreams, healthy, regular, functioning folks, you still might have a dream where you imagine yourself in pain or getting shot and you feel that sensation. So the subconscious is really volatile and variable in these sorts of things. Like, there are too many nuances between health and trauma to really make a solid claim viewing somebody from dreams alone. So that is another reason why it's cryptic. Mysteries are like that, though. We got to stay cryptic. So yeah. And then the final one is the third time that she goes into his mind and he freezes, and she somehow is able to break into his memory, which is later in oblivion, she finds out, and the memory ends up being restored. Why does he freeze? And what gets it restored is he can't reconcile what's true versus what has been induced upon him through trauma. I just finished a book. I finished another indie author's book. I'm hoping to interview her soon, so I'm not going to give names or titles. She's a YA author, and I believe she's still in high school, but she wrote this very, very beautiful book, and it's so fun. But there is a child in it. There's a teenager who grows up in a circumstance where his father is alcoholic and abusive because his mother suddenly died. And his dad didn't know how to handle it well, so he became a drinking and abusive father and forced his son to steal money so that he could drink all the time, and so on and so forth. So this teenager had grown up with that. But the way that she describes him trying to reconcile what's good, what's true, what's real versus his reality of being in so much pain and, why do I feel like I love my father even though he's hurting me? it's a very powerful book that really accurately describes so much of the difficulty in trying to reconcile what's real and what's not real when you have a trauma. But also a note on that is, if you've grown up in an abusive situation, you do really struggle to kind of decide and understand yourself. What, Luna? That's my other cat. You struggle within yourself to reconcile, like, how is it that I can still feel like, you are a person I'm supposed to love and admire. Maybe I did once love you. Maybe you were once good. Maybe I see the good in you. And yet you're doing these horrible things. It really rips you apart. And part of my biggest explorations into family science has come from this dilemma in myself, because I've seen a lot of good in my biological father. I've seen a lot of good in a lot of folks that have done bad. And yet they do these terrible things and they hurt you. And you kind of want to understand that. Now, should I have gone into psychology? Maybe. But for me, it's more about, I want to know how it influences families. So there's a side tangent there, but it is a complexity. Okay, Isabelle subconsciously. She's very different from Mario Ramazi. She really manifests regular dreams in the fact that they're so flamboyant, they're colorful, they kind of just go with things that she's seen on sitcoms, real life. She seems a very regular person in her dreams, to a point. I mean, she's very cooperative in that Azure can invoke things from her through images, through direct questioning, and Isabelle is just like, yeah, I'll tell you all these things, but not the deepest things. Those things are still kept in her, so she's still very cryptic. There's only so specific you can get in dreams sometimes, even if you do really want to share it, and trauma really can create a block like that for some folks. But for Isabelle specifically, betrayal trauma is what she is suffering the most from. That is the specific type of trauma. She had betrayal trauma in a sense, from her son, then from Carmen Laurent, then from her husband, even though she doesn't realize it. Then, of course, the trauma of losing her husband, having a new husband, and so on and so forth, being taken to this country, her children being taken away from her. She has a lot of betrayal trauma in her, and then chronic trauma from all of those things. And, had I been going through then what I am going through now with this specific type of trauma, I probably would have written her character very, very differently. What needed to happen with Isabelle did happen, so that it's all good, I guess. She will not be making a comeback in the series, though other characters will, but I feel for her. Also, a good point to bring up with her is that trauma differs by culture. A lot of things differ by cultures, but especially physiological symptoms differ by culture. So some of us who have trauma seriously have terrible insomnia. I'm having that again these days, and it is a struggle. Others don't. And in the Filipino culture, they sleep like no one else in the world sleeps. It's not just essential, it's like a basic, you just do it kind of thing. It is a fact of life. It is a precious fact of life, and nothing is going to disrupt that. When I lived in the Philippines, if we had set an appointment with a family and we would go knocking on their door, hey, like we said this a week ago, if they were sleeping, you could not wake them up. It was rude. It was what they call bawal, which is restricted, not allowed, don't touch that, kind of is the interpretation. You don't do it. If someone is sleeping, you do not wake them up. If they're sleeping and they're late for work, the employers, where we were in the very, very corner third world areas of the country, the very tippy top, the Lawag and Cagayan region. Yeah, it's been a while, but yeah, the employers would just be like, yeah, okay, you were sleeping. You don't lose your job over that, because sleep it's solid. You don't touch sleep. So for her, yeah, she can sleep like a queen, because that's part of her culture. That's just a little side note there. Did I do that intentionally? No, it just happened, but it makes sense because of the culture. So that is a happy happenstance for the book working out, or having that grip on sleep. Sleep also differs though by tech use, and then general health and so forth. And then our lifestyles also affect our response. Our trauma responses, how they manifest. There's also like generic correlations studied in responses, as well as like prenatal trauma is very, very different. And that's especially studied with how it manifests in epigenetics. So again, not my field. I've just kind of briefly dabbled in it. If you're interested in jumping down those rabbit holes, let me know. Subconsciously, she's less guarded than she is in person. She's in like a partial state of denial and in a partial state of apathy. You know, some of us have great control in our dreams, others don't. Isabelle, she's kind of scattered. That's where she falls on that spectrum. But then in person, she's hyper vigilant. She's very guarded. She's controlling. Again, that goes back to what I said about her looking like she's bipolar. So here's touching back on that response. But yeah, trauma responses, they can act like mental disorders, and they can even develop into them over time. So like some traumas that develop into mental disorders can lie dormant for several years until another traumatic trigger or experience similar to it will more or less like not catalyze. English again, it's leaving me. It's like a domino effect. It'll topple the domino that will make that trauma manifest, or the mental illness come into play. Some illnesses, transmitted illnesses, STDs, can lie dormant and then manifest later in years. So can certain types of cancer and so forth. So that is very much what it's like. I've seen in my life individuals that I love and cherish have had mental illnesses develop because of traumas in the past. But they've also had a family history of mental disorders. So I've always wondered if it was that case that the mental disorder was there and a trauma either triggered it or it developed because of it. I don't know. But the correlations are strong that those who have trauma generally have a stronger correlation, not causation, but correlation to later having mental illness or experiencing mental illness. The same with physiological responses. Gut disorders particularly are linked to childhood traumas. Is that why I have a gut disorder? I don't know. Is it affected by it? Oh, certainly. Stressful things make this flare up like there is no tomorrow. So, you know, it is a correlation, but those things do lie dormant and they do manifest in similar ways. The way that people behave in trauma can seem like, oh, you have a dissociative disorder, you have a phobic disorder, you have a behavioral disorder, when really it might just be, this is how I'm trying to cope with trauma. Good example with that, eating disorders. Eating disorders are often studied in psychology alongside mental disorders, but they are not mental disorders in and of themselves. Folks with mental disorders do have a correlation with having eating disorders. It's not the same though. Many folks that have eating disorders who had trauma in the past, the eating disorder is a way to kind of control their life, to get some sort of grip on reality, to make sure that they have some form of safety. Again, that control, it's their buddy, it's their companion, it's what's carrying them through. I know because I had an eating disorder once, and that's what it did for me. It was a source of control dealing with traumas that were going around me. So good example there. I don't know. You can let me know your thoughts. That is from my own personal studies and life. So Isabelle, she does have a kind of freeze response in person as well. She starts to kind of shut down more as the case progresses, as it becomes more real to her that this whole shebang that I have been coerced into or tricked into is now about to be caught, and I don't know where I stand. I don't know if I'm protecting my kids. I don't know if they're still alive. I don't know if what I'm doing is right or wrong. So she'll kind of participate with the authorities and she'll kind of pull back. And that's kind of how you have to play it when you're really traumatized, is who do I trust? Why do I trust them right now? And maybe I don't trust them the next minute. Seems bipolar. It's trauma. We're trying to navigate what's real. Alma's dreams. Oh my goodness. Alma's dreams are quite an interesting thing. So Azure enters Alma's dreams a couple times. She does it once when Phineas Granger drugs Alma up on Benadryl, extra Benadryl. I wish that would work for me. Those who have insomnia, it doesn't always work all the time. But yeah, so she's put under in drugs, and Azure goes into her mind. Another time, Azure goes to the bureau and goes through recorded dreams that Dr. Williams has taken from Alma. And those are two very different experiences. With being in person with Alma, we first start off seeing that Alma has this kind of awareness of a loss in her, that she's in this pool area that she's talking to this lady about, I lost a partner, I don't need a new partner. And she's pretty quiet and just kind of observing, and you can kind of feel this wave of uncertain emotions because something is missing. There is a person missing in her life, and she doesn't know who, but there is a figure there. And sometimes that's how we feel when we have traumas, especially traumas where we have lost somebody. In her case, it's someone she doesn't even remember, but she knows she lost somebody. Some children whose parents abandoned them at a young age, or, their parents died at a young age, they might have something similar to this. When you feel that there should be a person there and they're not, they are gone. If you lose a friend suddenly, tragic death, any of those sorts of things, it can be very much the same. So that's what it starts out as. And then they go into this house, and it changes in style and function. And eventually there's like fire and explosions, and she's trying to get out with this person. And we don't know the end of that. At the end of the whole dream sequence, though, things start to get pretty hectic to the point that Alma kind of reveals within her own mind hints about what may have happened, how she got her arm injury. She can feel it. She can feel her neurochip. She can feel her arm. Those traumas are coming back to haunt her. And then at the end, Azure asks, did you do this thing? And Alma says, I think I did, even though she can't remember. She thinks she did. Subconsciously, she can recall trauma that was occurring within her and that she also played a part in. The subconscious with trauma that is where trauma is stored, is in the subconscious. That's why recurrent night terrors, nightmares are very, very common with those who have PSTD and other traumas. I had more of an insomnia because I was paranoid, hypervigilant, that if I fell asleep, somebody would come down the stairs and something would happen to me. Others will have those night terrors where they will be reminded of some terrible experience that they had, or, if you had a friend who died, you might see them dying. If you saw somebody or something tragic happen, a car accident, etc., that will happen in your subconscious, sometimes in your dreams. And it's terrifying. It's utterly terrifying. And even if you don't know the real cause, even if it's something that didn't necessarily happen to you in person, or even for a very long time, like if you were abandoned as a child and you have dreams that you feel someone is missing and something bad happened, that is the subconscious storing that trauma in you and manifesting itself in dreams. So fascinating stuff there. Again, I didn't plan this. It wrote itself, but it is a real thing. Yeah, there's other bizarre things that happen, of course, in her recorded dreams. She starts off with this terrible fear that someone's coming after her. She's got to get away. And as Azure keeps going through the recordings, the common theme is that over time she becomes apathetic to it, complacent to it. And that disassociation is also a very, very common trauma response. Disassociation happens in different forms, in different intervals. Some folks are able to disassociate quite quickly. Others, it has to happen over time, over years. For most, I would say it takes years to kind of teach yourself that skill or learn it. There are healthy ways of disassociating. There are unhealthy ways of disassociating. I am not an expert on either because in the past, I have done both. But this is kind of what we're seeing Alma do, is she's disassociating from that fear. And Azure says that to her was more scary than Alma being scared. And it can be, because when you disassociate from your emotions and from the reality of it, when this becomes your new reality, you're a very different person. It can kind of be robotic. You're going through the motions, which in the second book, spoiler, Alma feels that she is going through the motions because this is her new reality. When you have complex chronic trauma that is going on that long, sometimes reality is safest when it has very little emotions, very little joys, very little pains. You just kind of go through it. It is a safety mechanism response, and it's a survival mode. That's really all that I can say about that. So that is how things manifest with Alma Morales. But she's still pretty kick butt and awesome. So I don't know. I have a lot of rep with her. The last thing I want to say about Alma Morales has to do with forgiveness. Specifically her forgiveness of Hastings. I am waiting for somebody to ask me this question who has gone through trauma or has gone through betrayal or anything of the sort, but how is it that Alma can so easily forgive Hastings? It's unrealistic. To which I will say, yes, no. It is realistic in this sense that sometimes we as human beings, trauma or not, have a capacity to forgive momentarily. Especially when we are in front of other people. It is easy to say to somebody in the face that, yeah, I forgive them and I'm chill with it, only to deal with those feelings later, or to be lying, or maybe we're unaware of a bigger picture, which to me is the more common thing. We don't know what we don't know till we know it. And it can be very easy to extend forgiveness to somebody who has traumatized you when you have a very limited scope as to why they did it, how they did it, how long it was, etc. My personal experience with this, going back to my father, because that is the most prominent example, but I have a couple more, is, when I first found out what he did and I couldn't reconcile my reality with this new truth, I frankly forgave him. Because that's the Christian thing to do, and it's easy, and I found a lot of peace in that. I really did, and I grew as a person from that, but I didn't actually have all the information. I didn't have the full picture, and I was dumb. I was naive enough to think that I didn't need to search for more information. I didn't want to, because I was quite content having that level of forgiveness, that, I don't ever need to know any more of what happened. The only time my father ever tried to address the topic, like, he's never asked me for forgiveness or anything. The only time he ever wanted to talk about it, he once said to me after that initial forgiveness, can we sometime go on a walk or something? I really want to get this cleared. And I said, I don't really want to talk about it, so maybe in the future, but right now I'm good. You're good, I'm good. Let's just move on. That was my response. I regret that response heavily. But truly, looking back, I don't think I could have handled it, what I didn't know back then. I thought so. I was, it was a protective mechanism for me. Maybe it is for Alma too in that moment. But the reality is, Alma's had a lot of memory loss at that point regarding what happened because of what Hastings did to her and her neurochip and whatnot. So yeah, it's easy to forgive when you have this much information and you can reconcile that to a point. You can be at peace with forgiving that. But later, when more information comes, you have to re-tackle that again. See, forgiveness is not a one-time thing. So even though in the book Alma forgives Hastings, the problem isn't over. Just like in real life, just because I forgive an abuser, just because I forgive somebody for lying to me, does not mean it's over. Anywhere from an hour, a day, a week, a year, several years, as more information comes about that, as we really think and try to process it more, serious emotions and difficulties are going to arise that need to be readdressed or addressed for the first time regarding that thing. So you have to either learn how to forgive again or retackle, what's real, what's not real, and all that sort of mess. Forgiveness, it's not only not a one-time thing, it's a very, very difficult thing. In moments, there are some moments where you will feel very strong and have peace within yourself to say, I forgive you, and then walk away and have a lot of anger. Now, anger and forgiveness, or unforgiveness and anger, are not the same thing. But if you are angry enough, you can determine and decide within yourself to no longer forgive. Just something I invite you to think about, because it's something I've thought about a lot. Kind of like trust isn't the same as love. Forgiveness isn't the same as trusting. You can forgive somebody without trusting them. I've had a couple individuals in my life, that teachers specifically, and some leaders that I don't trust. I forgive them for what they didn't intend to do to me, or maybe did in some cases. I'm not quite sure. I still don't have enough information. They hurt me really badly and I forgive them. But if I were, hanging from a rope and they were supposed to save my life, I would not trust them for a second to do that. I would hope that the goodness of who they are as a person would choose to, but I don't trust them. To address that potential question, if anybody ever has it, about what's going on there. Very subtle thing. Again, my book is not all this heavy stuff. There's a lot more fun in it than that. There's more notes on triggers that can re-exacerbate traumas. Yes, there are a lot of triggers that can bring back trauma. It really depends on your type of trauma, what caused it, what your triggers are, etc. A lot of individuals are different, and some people experience serious, heavy traumas, and they don't have as many triggers, and they don't have as serious trauma responses as those who experience less severe ones. It's like I said, everybody is, like, it is a subjective thing, depending on circumstance, situation, your genetics, your history, who you are as a person, and what you decide to do. But yeah, anywhere from depression, insomnia, heart racing, heart stopping, feeling physical pains like something is being stabbed in your back, in your chest, in your side, gut issues, some folks shake, overheating, losing body temperature. Those are all different ways that it manifests, in different responses. Ultimately, I would just say that trauma is literally a shattering reality, and it is the biggest battle to have to fight to live with and to get beyond it. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It is not intuitive. In fact, dealing with trauma is frequently counterintuitive, and so are many responses. Trauma responses are counterintuitive, so it's not something that just, fixes right away. You can't tell them, because when you have this trauma trigger, you react like this, do the opposite. Even though it's counterintuitive, it's not opposite. Things that you think will help probably won't help, or they won't feel comfortable. Kind of like, recovering from an eating disorder is very uncomfortable. The things that help you hurt. When you're healing from a serious injury, healing hurts. CPR, if somebody is seriously bleeding, you have to apply pressure, hard pressure on that, and it hurts. Your life being saved hurts. Yeah, I have a nervous laugh about that, but it really is a very, very, very serious topic. So that is about all I have on trauma today. I would invite you to consider how it presents in other literary works. It is a very serious, deep topic. But as you're going through literature, I guess this would be my final plea, specifically from the human development perspective. Really consider what messages you're feeding yourself where potential trauma is involved, especially acts of abuse and domestic violence in literature and media. I am so blessed to sit on the board of a nonprofit here in Wyoming, Strong Families, Strong Wyoming, that teaches healthy relationship science through programs that teachers can put in their classroom. But in the actual classrooms themselves, children are not learning what healthy relationships are. They're not. And with this economy and this world, parents rarely have time to teach what healthy relationships are or to model it. So where is the rising generation learning what relationships are supposed to look like from literature, from media, from fiction? And yes, fiction is fake, but if what you're learning to base your reality on is fiction, there's unrealistic expectations and understanding of love. Specifically, I get so tired of reading domestic abuse being portrayed as love in spicy romance novels. I get very tired of readers saying that they want to read about more morally gray traumatized men. Like, give me your gray your morally gray traumatized man. Because it's sexy, it's in, it's cool. Trauma isn't like that. If you actually live with somebody who has suffered trauma, yes, they can have moments where they will be intently, amazingly sexy or cool or whatever. But dealing on a regular basis with the darkness, the differences of realities, if they are seriously traumatized, it's It's not easy. It's not pretty. I'm not saying don't get in a relationship with somebody who's traumatized. I'm saying learn what that actually looks like, and not from fiction, because your happiness depends on it and their happiness depends on it. So that's kind of where I stand on fiction. So those are just a little deep dive look into how trauma does present in my novel, The Lattice Scheme. There will be healing discussed as well in the upcoming books. And you know, that is the beautiful thing about trauma, is it is difficult to live with trauma, but it's not only possible, you can still have a very fulfilling life. I mean, looking at Alma just in my book, she is still able to live as a full operating agent. She does so much good in the world. And looking at the folks in my life that I know who have gone through trauma, they are profound inspirations to me. So, you know, there's a lot of stigma on mental health, on trauma, on physical disorders, on mental disorders, emotional disorders. These things do not define our worth as human beings, and it certainly does not define our capacity to do good, to be good, and to function in this world. You know, in previous episodes, I've talked about how we limit ourselves with these beliefs that my ideal life is XYZ. That is the idea, and therefore if I don't live up to it, it's not possible for me. Well, that is true, but you can still live a fulfilling life, not matching it up to those exact expectations, but still making that possible with some adjustments when you have traumas, when you have mental illness, when you have mood disorders, mental disorders, physical disorders. It's about exploring, learning, discovering the mystery of how you become the fullest you. And that can be a beautiful thing in relationships, regardless of trauma or not trauma. So that is where I'm going to leave this podcast. Thank you for listening to this I'm sure it was rather redundant at times, but this very interesting episode on traumas and tragedies. I hope you enjoyed. Please feel free to leave any comments that you have on this topic below. And also, I hope if you haven't picked up a copy of The Lattice Scheme, go ahead and do that. If you would like a free copy, I am now giving out free EPUB copies to try to find ARC readers for the second book. If you're interested, leave a comment below, find me on Instagram, DM me. There's also a sign up link on my website that you can check out. Like, comment, subscribe, and thank you so much.